Welcome to the Introduction to Practical Experience Requirements to become a board-certified behavior analyst. Before beginning to accrue any hours, you need to secure a qualified supervisor. Supervision qualifications are detailed in the Fieldwork Requirements document. The most common supervisors hold BCBA or BCBA-D credentials, and they need to be in good standing with the board, maintaining their supervision, meaning they should not have any current disciplinary sanctions. They also need to be certified for at least 1 year and meet ongoing supervision CE requirements. Less common, but also an option, are supervisors who are licensed or registered psychologists that are certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology in behavioral and cognitive psychology and tested in applied behavior analysis. Another option for supervision are active BCBAs with no current disciplinary sanctions who are certified for less than 1 year and receiving monthly consultation from a qualified consulting supervisor. In addition, supervisors must also complete an 8-hour supervision training before they can start providing you any supervision. In the next slide, you will see how you can go to the BACB website to look up your potential supervisor and determine if they meet the requirements to provide supervision as a result of completing this 8-hour supervision training and being in good standing with their supervision CEs and maintaining an active certification.
BACB's website at bacb.com and click on Find a Certificate, and this will direct you to the certificate registry page. You can click on BCBA and BCBA-D and then type in your supervisor's last name and be sure to click those. And this will return the results for that name. So there's only one person with my name, and here I'm showing up in the registry. If you click on my name, you'll see this drop down, and it'll show that here I completed my 8-hour supervision training in 2015, and my certification is active, so I am eligible to supervise.
Coming back here, the very last thing that they mention in the experience standards for supervisor requirements is that with regards to the supervisor's trainee relationship, your supervisor may not be related to you. They may not be a subordinate of you or employed by you during the experience. Now that you've determined whether your supervisor or potential supervisor is qualified, let's take a look at the BACB's requirements for multiple supervisors or settings. Please note that the BACB does allow and in fact encourages trainees to have multiple supervisors or settings in order to meet their fieldwork experience requirements. In such cases, all parties must be sure that their individual responsibilities are clearly defined in the supervisor supervision contract, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. All of these supervisors are also responsible for signing off on the fieldwork or experience verification forms. If you have multiple supervisors at one organization, a single supervisor will need to be designated as the responsible supervisor, defined by the board as the supervisor who signs a BACB fieldwork experience verification form on behalf of an organization where multiple supervisors are providing supervision for one trainee. So all of the BCBAs that are supervising you need to meet those supervisor qualifications that we talked about earlier. However, you will have one supervisor designated as your responsible supervisor that will be signing off on your monthly paperwork. And then at the end of your experience for your final verification forms, all of your supervisors will need to be listed. So another common question that comes up is, what exactly is your field experience going to look like? And it's going to look different for each of you because it's going to be based on your site and the clients that you're working with. And a lot of it is also related to your supervisor's style and how they provide these training opportunities and supervision. So, according to the board, your primary focus should be on acquiring the skills necessary to demonstrate competence of relevant tasks and applicable to our sixth edition task list outline or whatever the current edition the BACB is operating under, and the skills necessary to effectively interact with your clients, your supervisors, families, other professionals, and then some. And so your supervisor is responsible for determining whether activities that you engage in qualify for accruing those experience hours consistent with those standards. And while it says here that your supervisor is responsible for saying, yes, these hours count versus no, they don't, it's very important to remember that the experience standards and their definition of acceptable activities has continued to evolve. So you still need to make sure that you are acting in accordance with the most current version of the BACB experience standards, even if your supervisor were to say, oh, I think, you can count 2 hours for doing X, Y, or Z. If it's explicitly stated in here that that's not an appropriate activity to count, then you shouldn't count it because you are also responsible for ensuring the accuracy of any documentation you submit in meeting these requirements. So according to these standards, it says trainees are strongly encouraged to have multiple experiences, so working with different client settings and ideally working with multiple supervisors. So the activities that you're encouraged to learn are conducting behavior analytic assessment, designing, implementing, and monitoring behavior analytic programs needed for or related to implementing intervention, writing treatment plans, progress notes, etc., overseeing the implementation of behavior analytic programs by others. So actually doing that training and supervision yourself of other people, training and designing behavioral systems and performance management systems, communicating and collaborating effectively with caregivers, professionals, other behavior analysts, so on and so forth. And any other activities that are normally performed by your BCBA or behavior analysts that are directly related to behavior analysis, such as attending meetings that are solely around behavior analytic content and researching literature that is relevant to a current client or a current client's programming. I want to make a special point here. That is, I want to point out this bit about reading articles. Reading articles for the sake of reading articles is not considered an acceptable activity. However, as a clinician, you may find yourself, and you should find yourself, consistently going back to the literature to determine what best practices are and how to further improve your programs. And so when you are conducting research for the purpose of a specific client's needs, that research would certainly count towards your fieldwork. Of all the qualifying activities you engage in, they're going to be classified into one of two categories, restricted activities and unrestricted activities. According to the board, there is a restriction on the overall amount of hours that may be spent delivering therapeutic and instructional procedures during fieldwork. This restriction is designed to ensure that trainees have sufficient time to acquire the other skills necessary for practicing as a BCBA. Restricted activities may comprise no more than 40% of the total fieldwork hours, not per month, but the total hours that you accrue. Please note that this restriction does not necessarily refer to all the time spent working with clients. So here's the catch. All restricted activities are client-facing. However, not all client-facing activities are necessarily restricted activities. In addition to the examples provided in the fieldwork requirements document, be sure to check out the qualifying hours cheat sheet posted in D2L for more examples of activities broken down by each category. This tends to be a big point of confusion for trainees and supervisors alike, so be sure to refer back to this fieldwork requirements document frequently. Another big point of confusion comes from individuals referring to restricted and unrestricted activities as direct versus indirect activities. The latter is outdated verbiage, although it's still used in practice largely by individuals who deliver insurance-funded services, and in that context, it means something different. So be sure to use the correct words when you're discussing your fieldwork hours so as to avoid any misunderstandings between you and your supervisor. The whole purpose of the percentage restrictions is because restricted activities are primarily delivered by behavior technicians, sometimes also called therapists, and the program implementers who work under the supervision of the behavior analyst. However, your fieldwork training should prepare you to practice as a behavior analyst, not a technician. And as such, the board puts restrictions into place to ensure that the majority of hours that you're accruing are giving you practice being a behavior analyst and not just giving you practice functioning as a technician. On that note, if you are hired as an employee for your fieldwork training, specifically in the role of a technician or therapist, it is likely that the majority of your employee responsibilities will be considered quote-unquote restricted activities. If this is the case, then you should expect to spend extra hours outside of whatever you agreed for employment purposes to also get training and experience in unrestricted activities. This should be discussed with your supervisor during the interview process or at the very least during the creation of the supervisory contract. The board also articulates activities that will never count and should never be counted towards your qualifying fieldwork. So they state only behavior analytic activities may be counted towards experience requirements. Non-behavior analytic activities, while valuable, may not be counted. Examples include, but are not limited to, attending meetings with little to no behavior analytic content. So if you have to go to a general staffing meeting or something like that, certainly any provision of services that are not based in behavior analysis, but you are required to do this as part of your employment, that cannot count towards your fieldwork experience. Performing any non-behavioral administrative activities like scheduling or time cards don't count towards any behavior analytic training. So if you have to attend CPR training or using a data management system or something like that, unless the training on the data management system is specific to the client's programming, then they should not be counted towards your hours. Any completion of non-behavioral assessments or documentation, billing, etc., attending conferences also do not count. And any assignments that you have to do for class that are not directly related to working on site also do not count. You cannot double dip those hours between your coursework and your fieldwork. I also want to make a point here about listening to podcasts. Students are often assigned this task to count towards unrestricted activities, and this does not count as an acceptable activity. However, if it is specific to a client's case and you and your supervisor discuss the content of a podcast or utilize its information within your supervision meeting or towards doing programming for your client, it might count. So it's important that you again remember that you may be asked to do some of these quote unquote unacceptable activities as part of your position if you're employed by the agency, and those activities are the responsibility of your employment. But that doesn't mean that you can count them towards your fieldwork experience requirements. You may also be asked to do things off-site, such as doing that research, writing plans, designing programs, and that's okay to count as long as they're considered those acceptable activities that were reviewed previously. So there's nothing that says that you have to be on site in order for hours to count, and that should make sense because a lot of the work that we do is not confined to a geographic location. Another part of your experience is, of course, going to be supervision. And the board says that the purpose of supervision is to improve and maintain your behavior analytic, professional, and ethical repertoires and facilitate the delivery of high quality services for your training to your clients. So effective supervision should include, but is not limited to, your supervisor providing you, monitoring you on any skills that you are demonstrating throughout the experience, your supervisor developing and communicating performance expectations, your supervisor conducting behavioral skills training, observing you and giving you feedback based on whatever was observed during your observations, your supervisor modeling technical, professional, ethical behavior, your supervisor guiding you through the process of case conceptualization, problem solving, and decision making, your supervisor reviewing any written materials that you may create, such as data sheets or reports, your supervisor overseeing and evaluating the effects of your service delivery, so going through and making sure that the work that you're doing with your clients is actually effective and delivered with high treatment integrity, and your supervisor evaluating the effects of their supervision throughout your fieldwork experience, meaning your supervisor soliciting feedback from you throughout this process. So the topography or the form of supervision, these are all different things that can occur during supervision. And what that looks like on site going through those motions is going to vary. Some supervisors do a lot of in the moment observations, especially in clinic type settings, and some supervisors may do that and also have defined supervisory sessions. So every week, having this set time and day set aside for supervision. Um, this is a current standard of requirement that is shifting in 2027. Uh, Something called a supervisory contact, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But currently, the BACB requires that a supervisory contact or any supervision session or something that is classified as a supervision session has to be at least 15 minutes in duration. So if you're running a program with your client and your supervisor walks by and watches you for 3 minutes and says, okay, you're on track, that's not going to count currently, but in starting January 1st, that can count towards something called cumulative observation, and we'll talk about that in a second. It is important at the onset of your relationship that you really discuss with your supervisor what supervision is going to look like and what defined periods of your time are going to count as supervision. Because the documentation standards for documenting supervision have changed or might have changed since your supervisors were trained. So this is going to be a potential point of confusion that's important to get clarification on at the beginning of your supervisory relationship. The fieldwork requirements document also outlines all the responsibilities of your supervisor, the commitments that they are making to you as a trainee, And in the document, you'll see that it says in this section, when behavior analysts are functioning as supervisors, they must take full responsibility for all facets of this experience, and therefore it is the responsibility of the supervisor to ensure that the trainee abides by all ethical and legal requirements. Responsibilities of the supervisor include, but are not limited to, being fluent in current and compliant with all the BACB requirements related to field work, meaning they need to be familiar with these expectations that are outlined in the document, confirm that the trainee has met all the requirements prior to the outset of supervised field work, so making sure that before they allow you to begin accruing hours, you've met the requirements to start doing so. Mainly that you have started your coursework towards becoming a BCBA, consistently demonstrating technical, professional, and ethical behaviors for the trainee, ensuring that fieldwork activities are in best interest of your client rather than for the purpose of meeting the fieldwork requirements. So here they're saying that all the activities that your supervisor is delegating to you should be delegated because they're applicable to some client that you're working with, and not because it's just the next thing on the task list that you should start working on. This is really the difference between your fieldwork supervision and what you get to learn and practice in class. So obviously, these practical experience requirements are so that you can get to practice doing the things that you wouldn't typically do with clients. And of course, we only want to be doing these specific techniques or interventions with your clients if it is appropriate to do so, in that it's going to be beneficial for the client, specifically providing supervision only within areas of defined competence. So your supervisor should only be delegating and supervising you in tasks that they are competent to practice in themselves, taking on only a volume of supervisory activity that is commensurate with their ability to be effective. So if your supervisor has such a large caseload of trainees or clients that they cannot effectively supervise you in meeting all of these requirements, then they would be in violation of this ethical obligation, delegating to the trainees only those responsibilities that the trainees can reasonably be expected to perform competently. Delegating to the trainees only those responsibilities that the trainees can be reasonably expected to perform competently, ethically, and safely, and in instances where you're not, the supervisor is responsible for providing the conditions for the trainee to acquire those skills in a safe and ethical manner. So your supervisor is required to train you and to ensure that you are competent to engage in those activities before they actually delegate the activity for you to do with the client. Obviously, we wouldn't want you practicing errors with a client, for example, and thus potentially resulting in impeding their progress. Lastly, ensuring that supervisory supervision fieldwork activities and trainings are behavior analytic in content and effectively and ethically designed and meet the requirements for licensure, certification, or other defined goals. And if we notice where it says that the training activities are effectively designed, this means that your supervisor has to be taking data on your performance, your progress in acquiring those skills, because that's going to lead them to evaluate the effectiveness of their training and supervision. If they continue to train you in a method that doesn't result in you acquiring those skills, then they would be in violation of that ethical obligation. So if your supervisor isn't fulfilling one or more of these responsibilities, they're violating our ethical code, and that obviously needs to be addressed. So your supervision sessions or contacts are going to be categorized as either group or individual. According to the board, supervision should ideally consist of individual, meaning just you and your supervisor or your clients one-on-one. They mean that your supervisor is not dividing their attention between you and any other field experience or practicum students within one-on-one supervision. Or you can get group supervision. In group supervision meetings, this is when there is a minimum of two, but no more than 10 fieldwork experienced students who are sharing the experience or being supervised for different supervision activities at the same time. And regardless of the number of BCBAs in those meetings, you cannot have more than 10 field experience students. The meeting at any given time, in order for it to count as supervision, just because they want to make sure that there's actually enough time being spent getting individualized attention during the meeting for it to count as supervision. If there are any non-field experienced students that are present during the meetings, their participation should really be limited and not inhibit any kind of discussion or feedback that you would typically get during your supervision meeting. And the purpose again is that this is around supervision and training of your performance. So if you're kind of in a staff meeting and you're all talking about different programs and there just happen to be three other field experienced students, it is probably not likely that that is going to count towards supervision. You can certainly count that as unrestricted hours if the content of the meeting is related to behavior analytic programming. But if it's a general staff meeting and it's not specific to developing your repertoire, then it shouldn't be counted as group supervision. So, as I was mentioning earlier, there are some restrictions in place for that group supervision. So, the amount of group supervision may not exceed the amount of individual supervision in any given period. So, that means in a 1 month long supervisory period, you should have at least as much individual supervision as you do group. So your hours can be thought of in two main categories as supervised hours or independent hours. Your supervised hours are all those hours where your supervisor is actually present with you while you're working, and this can take place in that individual basis or group format with no more than 10 trainees. And so in that part of the classification under the supervised hours, those can be a 50-50 split. They can also be activities where you are just doing a meeting, where you're discussing what you're working on, or an actual observation of you working with a client. So during your observational supervisions, your supervisor can observe you engaging in either restricted or unrestricted activities, but they must observe you working with the client in some capacity. That is, in order for it to count as supervisor contact and not just an observation, your supervisor must be present during the actual activity. So this must be done either as a face-to-face observation or a synchronous video observation, so like a live FaceTime or something like that. More recently, they have said that this observation may be conducted using recorded videos. So, like I was talking about the breakdown of hours, we have the supervised hours with the supervisor present. There can be individual or group, a meeting or observation. You also are working independent hours that can count towards your field work and that don't require your supervisor to be present. These are also classified as either restricted or unrestricted based on the previous definitions of those words we talked about. During your independent hours, you can get an observation from your supervisor if you're engaging in those activities and they're observing you asynchronously, which means you're recording yourself and giving them a video to watch after the fact. So this can count as an observation, but not necessarily a supervisory contact. However, after they view that recording, the debriefing meeting can count as supervision. Every supervisory experience has to start with a supervision contract that is signed and written. So it cannot be a type of verbal agreement, and it has to be separate from any employment related paperwork you have signed with the organization. The purpose of this contract is to protect all parties involved and make sure that all expectations from all parties are clearly laid out. Because in any instances where your experience is contested or audited, you're going to have your contract to show how you met those expectations. So in the contract, Your supervisor needs to lay out their commitments and responsibilities to you, as well as what your responsibilities and expectations are. And they also have to state that they have done the 8-hour training and that they've met the supervisor qualifications and that they will maintain continuing education related to supervision. The contract should also stipulate the activity and training objectives for you specifically, not in general. And they should also include objective and measurable circumstances under which the supervisor will and will not sign the final paperwork that gets submitted to the board. So when we're talking about designing those objectives and how your supervisor is going to evaluate you towards meeting those objectives, that's your measurable piece. So typically, you will have some type of evaluation criteria outlined on the supervisory contact form. And in the contract, it may say something like, get 3 consecutive needs improvements, or if you engage in an instance of unethical violation, if you fail to show up to a session 3 times or more, or something like that, then the supervisor is not going to sign off on your paperwork. And this is really important that it is clearly laid out, because if you think you're doing fine and your supervisor doesn't, and that's not documented and objectively stated anywhere, then it may be quite the surprise to you if your supervisor says at any point, no, you didn't meet my expectations and I'm not going to sign this paperwork or these documents. And so then in the contract, you also have to attest to both of your mutual agreement to follow all of the BACB's ethical guidelines. Now, let's take a look at the current hours breakdowns for fieldwork requirements. Please note that these are the requirements that are currently in place and have been in place since January 2022, and there are going to be some slight differences between now and January 2027. You'll notice in the fieldwork requirements, there are 2 different options. You can either do supervised fieldwork or concentrated fieldwork. For folks that are doing supervised fieldwork, you need 2,000 total hours to sit for the certification exam. And for those doing concentrated, you only need 1,500. The reason for the difference in the total number of hours is relative to the increased intensity of supervision that is provided in the concentrated fieldwork experience. So for both categories, and similar to those for the experience standards, the supervisory period is 1 month, and the minimum and maximum number of hours that can be recorded in a calendar month is 20 to 130. So you can accrue a minimum of 20 hours a month and a maximum of 130 hours. For those that are doing supervised fieldwork, you need at least 4 supervisory contacts, those 15-minute meetings with the supervisor per month, and at least 1 observation that is conducted during the supervisory contacts or in addition to them. At least 5% of the hours accrued each month must be supervised, similar to those requirements in previous standards. In the standards for concentrated fieldwork, the number of contacts per month increases to 6, but there's still only 1 observation required. However, 10% of your total hours accrued each month must be comprised of supervision. So under supervised fieldwork, if you accrued 100 total hours in a calendar month, including supervised and independent hours, at least 5 of those 100 hours would need to be supervised, and those 5 hours would need to be distributed across at least 4 contacts or sessions, and you need to be observed with the client at least once that month, either during one of those 4 contacts or in addition to them. And at least 2.5 of those 5 hours would need to be individual supervision. The same 50-50% standards are in place for the group and individual supervision for fieldwork requirements. However, if you are doing concentrated fieldwork, if you accrue 100 hours in the calendar month, you would need at least 10 of those 100 hours to be supervised. Those 10 hours would need to be distributed across 6 supervisory contacts, and you would need to be observed with the client at least once in that month, either during those contacts or in addition to them. At least 5 out of those 10 supervised hours would need to be comprised of individual supervision. Starting January 1st, 2027, the supervisory requirements to make you eligible for the exam have some updates. Previously, you needed 10% of your hours to be supervised for concentrated fieldwork. Next year onwards, you will only need 7.5%. So if you were collecting 100 hours, instead of needing 10 of those 100 hours to be supervised, you would only need 7.5 hours. The maximum number of hours you can accrue per supervisory period, meaning per month, goes up from 120 to 160 hours. Previously, fieldwork stipulated a certain number of observations for either supervised or concentrated fieldwork. Starting January 2027, the board stipulates a cumulative number of minutes instead of the number of contacts or observation times. So they require 60 minutes cumulative observations with the client for supervised fieldwork and 90 minutes cumulative for concentrated fieldwork. So trainees may accrue hours in a single category or may combine the two types to meet their total requirements, either within a supervisory period, meaning within a single month, or across supervisory periods, meaning across months. With fieldwork hours for concentrated, having approximately 1 1/3 times the temporal value of supervised fieldwork. So what that means is that if you did a combination of those two types, then you would be working towards the 2,000 total instead of the 1,500. But for all the hours that you met the requirements for concentrated fieldwork, those would be multiplied by 1.33 and added to your running total to get that total of 2,000. You should note that trainees must meet all of the supervision requirements independently for each type of fieldwork. So for example, the required percentage of supervision and cumulative minutes must be met independently for each fieldwork type. So if you're doing both concurrently within a single month, you need to make sure that you're getting the percentage of supervision and cumulative minutes for each type of supervision. So you and your supervisor should plan in advance to meet the increased cumulative observations as well as the percentage requirements for any month so that you can take advantage of that multiplier I just mentioned. Just a few additional notes. For fieldwork requirements, they define the onset of fieldwork as when you begin your qualifying coursework towards your BCBA certification, which for NLU students would be the first day of ABA 500 and when you have secured a qualified supervisor. So remember before when we talked about the supervision contract, that has to be executed before you can start counting hours. So you can't start your ABA coursework, get a job, start logging hours, and then a couple weeks later actually secure a supervisor. That agreement between you and your supervisor has to be in effect and executed before you actually start counting those hours. All of your field work needs to be completed within a 5 continuous year period. So if you are stopping and starting and going at a more leisurely pace, just be mindful that you have to finish all of your supervision and fieldwork requirements within a 5 year period. When we're talking about appropriate clients, we need to be mindful that you cannot be related to any of your clients. You cannot be any of your clients' primary caregiver, so none of your children or dependents can be your clients, or you cannot be related to a client's primary caregiver. You cannot be related to your client's parent or guardian. You must work with and be observed with and receive feedback from your supervisor for working with multiple clients. And so this is something to be mindful of. If you are working very few hours per month, or if you're only working with one client at an agency, at a certain point, you need to work with at least one other client in order to meet the board's requirements. The board also allows accrual of hours for partial months in instances, for example, if you're not working for the entire calendar month. So in instances when you're not working for an entire calendar month, your supervisor may determine that it's appropriate to prorate the requirements for that month with regards to the number of contacts that are required, the percentage of supervision, or the amount of group supervision that you received. But things like the minimum and maximum number of hours for a month, complete lack of observations, or forms not being signed on time are not prorated. So be mindful of that. The board now gives some direction on how to make this adjustment, as seen here. Because fieldwork varies across settings and practice areas, the BACB gives supervisors and trainees the flexibility to develop their own system for documenting ongoing supervision and fieldwork in a way that demonstrates adherence to all relevant requirements and the code. Here is a video that is a pretty helpful guide from the BACB on how to go about documenting fieldwork hours. You will note that documentation must include the following information. For those independent hours, meaning those hours in which you and your supervisor are not together, but you're still getting field work, each session must include the documentation of the date, the start time, the end time, the type of field work, the name of the supervisor, and the activity category as restricted or unrestricted. For those supervised hours, for each contact, the document must include the date, start time, end time, fieldwork type, the type of supervision, meaning individual or group, the type of activity, meaning restricted or unrestricted, as well as a summary of supervision activities. For each observation, document the date, start time, end time, the type of fieldwork, the name of the setting, the supervisor's name, and the category of the activity. The board also has specific verification forms to be documenting your fieldwork experience. So they have monthly verification forms and final verification forms at the end of each calendar month. In addition to that supervisory period, unique documentation system, you also need to be completing a monthly verification form, which is available to download from the board's website. And then at the very end of your field work, or if you're switching settings at the end of your experience at each setting, you also need to complete a final verification form. When you go to the website, you'll notice that there are two versions of each, depending on whether or not you have multiple supervisors versus a single supervisor. If you're working with multiple supervisors, which is very common, then you'll want to make sure that you're using those forms so that you can have your responsible supervisor sign off in the designated area. The monthly fieldwork verification forms must be signed on the last day of the calendar month following the period of supervision. And we recommend that the final fieldwork verification forms be signed at the end of a specific fieldwork experience. Both parties must retain a copy of the completed fieldwork forms for at least 7 years. Please note that the BACB is very strict about this, that backdated or retroactively completed forms will not be accepted. So just a few last things to close up. First and foremost, really be your own best advocate in this experience. You will get out of it what you put in it. And remember, the EO is on you. This is your repertoire that is going to be developing, and your supervisor will always have things coming up or things competing for their attention. For example, their utmost priority is typically their clients. So you need to put your best foot forward and really commit to making this experience everything that it could be so that any of those burdensome, difficult things that come along with being in a fieldwork relationship, either for you and your supervisor, can be sort of reduced and both of you really find this to be mutually rewarding and mutually beneficial. If they find interacting with you to be rewarding, they're more likely to engage and interact with you. And same for them. If you find interacting with them to be more rewarding, you are more likely to engage with them. And remember to reflect on that as your relationship with your supervisor is developing. The second tip really is time management and organization. And this is one thing that students struggle with the most as they transfer into doing formal field work. Even if they've already been working as a technician, because fieldwork comes with a lot of paperwork and keeping track of a lot of requirements. And for those people that are just starting out in technician positions and also simultaneously entering the fieldwork experience, it's quite different than a 9 to 5 job. And so there's a lot of different types of paperwork you could be juggling. And it is so easy to fall behind on things like keeping track of your hours and getting your paperwork signed on time. So it's important that you engage in some good time management strategies and stay organized so that you don't fall behind. I recommend talking early on to your supervisor about this and coming to the faculty if you need any suggestions on how to go about creating good systems. On that note, understand that when you're completing your fieldwork supervision, you are not only representing yourself, but you're also representing the university and the program in the field of behavioral analysis. So it's important that you're always paying attention to how you are engaging professionally and abiding by all of our ethical guidelines as outlined by the BACB. Even if you haven't taken an ethics course yet, you are still obligated to abide by all of those guidelines outlined in our code. So it's really important that you review those materials and stay on top of them and seek out those learning opportunities for consultation with regards to ethics and professional behavior with your supervisor early and often. One of the other things that I think is important to reiterate, even if it should seem common sense, is that ultimately fieldwork is an opportunity for you to learn. You're not just there to put your hours in and clock in, get all those paperwork signed so that you can go and take the exam. You are there to learn. If you already knew everything, then you wouldn't need to be doing this. So remember to treat this as a learning opportunity, even when you're in situations when you feel like you're uncomfortable or things are not going well, or any of those difficult situations with your client or with your supervisor, there still is a learning opportunity there. And on the topic of difficult conversations, it's always a struggle for students if they don't hit it off with their supervisor right away. But please know that you can always come to your faculty members to have an objective, third party set of eyes and ears to talk about anything that's going on in the context of your supervision. If you need any help navigating a difficult situation, you can definitely come and talk to any of the faculty about it. Sometimes there are dual relationships with your supervisors also being your employers and those competing contingencies. But just know that the faculty are always here to support you and support your supervisor in any situations where we can offer guidance or other types of resources.